Welcome to a new daily top Askreddit video. Today's topic: which deceased person, if brought back to life, would be the most surprised to learn they became famous posthumously? Ötzi the Iceman. It's the earliest surviving naturally mummified human remains, at about 5,000 years old. It would take a while to explain the concept of fame to him first. I remember reading about this in a standardized reading test in 4th grade. It was so interesting that I read it a bunch of times and almost ran out of time to finish the section LMAO. Edit, since lots of people are asking, I am also 19. How old are you? I think I remember reading that too. Edit, thanks for the gold. Vincent van Gogh, the dude was severely depressed his whole life and only sold one painting while alive. He eventually killed himself only for his art to be worth millions now. Obligatory Doctor Who link, https://youtube.com. One of the greatest moments of revived series. This part always brings me to tears. This show is so amazing. I searched the comments for Van Gogh, because whenever I think of Van Gogh, I think of Doctor Who. That moment when he sees all his work around a modern city gallery will always give me shivers. One of the finest moments in any TV series history. I lived in Amsterdam for a few years and always wondered what Van Gogh would make of the mobs of tourists at the museum dedicated solely to his work. Especially because more visit that museum than the Rijksmuseum next door with countless Rembrandts and Vermeers and other Dutch masterworks. There is an episode of Doctor Who where they meet Van Gogh. I won't spoil anything about the episode, but it's stunningly beautiful. Edit to include my favorites. This, Vincent and the Doctor, is one of the greatest episodes in television history, in my opinion, edit, critically speaking. But I have other factors at play. Stuff I was going through personally. The people I was with at the time. Things that might not necessarily be objectively better, and which I have referred to as my personal favorites, separate from best of lists. Blink is also amazing. Terrifying the first time. But Silence in the Library, and the partner episode Forest of the Dead, takes it for me. I cry every damn time. Shout out to the empty child and the Doctor dances. Oh, and I was reminded below of the girl in the fireplace. Such a beautiful episode. The sets were so good. If you want to be deeply unsettled, give Midnight a watch. Pitch perfect performances. I've also been reminded of Asylum of the Daleks and the Doctor's Wife. For lighter things, the Adipose episode is right up there. Also the first episode of S2, and the 11th Hour. Herman Melville, author of Moby Dick, he was considered an unsuccessful writer while he was alive. He only managed to sell about 3,000 copies of Moby Dick in his time, now it's one of the most well-known classics. Emily Dickinson. Edgar Allan Poe. Sylvia Plath. Franz Kafka. There'd be a lot of shocked writers on this list. Kafka is the most brutal for me. Tormented from birth by his domineering father and working a depressing job he felt was pointless, wondering what the reason for his existence was. He found an outlet through writing and made one good friend that encouraged him to keep going. He died at 42 from tuberculosis, with his one wish being that all of his works were burnt. So glad he didn't listen and published them anyways. But he died thinking he had an icosecatial existence, and you really feel it with the themes of pointless bureaucracy in the trial and pure plight and eisegephilus and helplessness in the metamorphosis. And Jane Austen. I'd love to see her reaction to Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies. Anne Frank. They published my diary. And it's been read by millions of people. So Anne actually was in the process during her arrest of preparing her diary for publication, as they heard in a broadcast some diaries might be published after the war. I know someone who read the true original for research, and apparently it's much longer and filled with more mundane stuff most people wouldn't be interested in reading. Alan Turing. This is a great answer. His achievements were supposed to be top secret. As were other things. I think Shakespeare would be flawed if he knew his works were still being taught and read. Seriously, you guys read my plays that are meant to be watched. What, you egg? He stabs him. Still being taught and read. That's not even doing it justice. Every high school graduate in America has read at least a few phrases, if not multiple poems and plays by Shakespeare. Whole classes are taught just on him. People dedicate their lives to just his works. He is likely the most well-known playwright of all time. In order to earn a degree in English literature, I was forced to take not one, but 2 Shakespeare classes on top of my AP English in HS that was at least 50% Shakespeare focused too. I struggled through it so that I could take the classes that I really wanted on the Romantic and Gothic authors. I know it's sacrilege to hold an English lit degree and have no particular regard for the bard, but this is my hill and my axe and I'll die on it. It's more than that. Every English-speaking school in every country would learn about Shakespeare. It's almost as fundamental as learning sentence structure. What I personally think he would find more surprising is that there are Shakespeare snobs who feel like his work should be revered when he was, in his own way, the TV of his time. It's the same with people being snobby about Mozart. Seriously. He was a bratty little pop star. Not saying he wasn't talented, but why be snobby about classical music? Gotta say, that's why I have a soft spot for Andre Rieu. Have fun. Enjoy life. Love Shakespeare's poetry and the poetry in rap. Love Kesha and the Radetzky March, or, since I'm talking about Mozart, Ekliakt music. Whatever. Enjoy. Most importantly, tell the people that you love and admire, that you feel that way. People need to know that they are valued when they are alive. After death is no help to them. Rasputin would be proud and confused. Especially if he heard the song and fictitios written about him. Fictitios. You know what, I won't even ask. Yeah, there's a couple of fictitios I found which were like Rasputin x Rita, Rasputin x Anastasia, Don't Ask, and Rasputin x Tsarina Alexandra. Then there's ones where Rasputin rises from the dead. They're hard to find though. Ra Rasputin. Lover of the Russian Queen. Joseph Merrick, otherwise known as the Elephant Man. I think he would be surprised about how many plays, books and even had a movie made about him. Edit. Well, thank you guys for silver, and yes, I know that Joseph Merrick was famous in time, but I think that he'd be surprised that he's even more famous, but also that today's time he would be more accepted. I think people of this generation would be more supportive of him in general. Poor guy was treated harshly throughout his lifetime. His is a unique story of how a man with such childhood abuse, tremendous hardship, and immense physical constraint could still come out of all of it a gentle soul. Truly a one-of-a-kind personality when the cycle of abuse so commonly breeds future abusers and bitter human beings. That Roman in Pompeii who died while masturbating. That's the way I want to go out. You wanna come as you go? Franz Kafka. He had no faith in his work, and his will stated the executor of it to destroy them all. Other guy went against these wishes and published. That's so Kafkaesque. I think your comment would have been better if instead you had written, please, sir, no meat touching. That dude's dead wife. Why does everyone want to have sex with me? What the hell happened? This is why. Just in case anyone doesn't know what this reference is. Henrietta Lacks. Story. Henrietta Lacks was a young black woman who, in 1951, went to Johns Hopkins because of a knot in her womb. Turns out, the knot was a cervical tumor. Some cell samples, both healthy and cancerous, were taken without her permission or knowledge. She died at the age of 31 when the cancer metastasized throughout her body. However, the extracted cancer cells were successfully immortalized. These immortalized cells were the key to an unbelievable amount of medical research. The polio vaccine, cancer behavior and treatments, radiation reactions, allergic reactions to glues, paints and all kinds of chemicals, all these studies are done on Henrietta Lacks cells, HeLa. To date, more than 50 million tons of HeLa cells have been grown worldwide. Her family didn't find out about them until 1975, and family medical records have been released to the general public. If you're interested in finding out more, there's a book called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks that talks about the whole thing. Edit. Hey guys, thanks for the interest in this comment. I'm gonna take this opportunity to answer some questions and to discuss some critiques that you've presented. Does it matter that she was black? For the most part, not really. People researching the life of Henrietta tend to agree that her treatment was fairly standard for that particular hospital at that particular time. However, I felt that it was important to mention, not only to add context to her life, but to open a discussion of the ethical ramifications of events. At the time, the US was segregated, which meant black people were only allowed to visit certain hospitals. In Henrietta's case, this meant Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. At the time, this hospital was primarily used by people who were poor or black, or commonly, both. The doctors in charge of her also seemed to have taken advantage of her by lying about treatments. So, despite the fact that her treatment was standard at the time, we cannot separate her identity from the events surrounding her. Was no consent standard? Yes, at the time most patients weren't asked for consent when samples were extracted for diagnosis. However, these were not the samples that I'm talking about. When she was admitted and given radiation treatment, samples were removed from her uterus. This was most definitely not standard, and is part of the ethical discussion. Does her family deserve money / should she be viewed as a scientific figure? This might be a tough one, and slightly controversial. While I believe most of us will agree that there might be an ethical dilemma with the way her cells were obtained, we have to focus exclusively on the cells themselves. Because Henrietta, for everything that happened, did not represent an advance in science. The disease that killed her did. If anything, she represents an advance in scientific ethics. In recent years, her family has also been given a measure of control over the use of her cells as part of her legacy. And there's also the fact that her doctors kept her coming back for more treatments. At the end of the day, I don't think I'm the one who should pass judgment and decide. It's a complicated and practically unique situation to be in. It is also important to note that Johns Hopkins University does not have a patent on her cells, nor have they made a profit on them, according to them. The question of whether or not your cells belong to you is a legal one, and I believe there has already been a ruling in California that states that they do not. However, this is all opinion and is not the objective truth. This is part of an intellectual discussion and all opinions are important here. If you have a different one, feel free to speak up and say it. But remember, being respectful is the most important part of this discussion. I'd like to give a small disclaimer here, I'm not a cell biologist or a pathologist. I work in analytical chemistry. So my training might not be 100% focused on this subject, but I've studied enough to give a general explanation. What was special about HeLa, / isn't all cancer immortal? So, first let's talk about cell reproduction. If you remember back to middle school biology, cells have to copy their genetic material every time they reproduce. Problem is, this copy isn't perfect. Despite the cell's best efforts, there are sometimes errors, mutations, and some of the information at the ends are simply lost. In order to prevent this loss, or to mitigate it a bit, cells have junk DNA at the ends of their genes. This junk is called a telomere. Now, when a cell divides, it doesn't lose important DNA, just the junk bit at the end. However, after enough divisions, the telomere runs out, and the cell starts to die. This is called senescence. Sometimes, the cell goes a bit crazy and reactivates the enzyme responsible for producing telomerase, telomerase reverse transcriptase. This enzyme essentially makes the cell immortal. It can now replicate indefinitely. This is cancer. Now, these immortal cells are really interesting for science, and scientists had been working practically since 1900 to properly cultivate cells. In fact, in 1940 *** George G.E. *** he's important, and Wilton Earl, him, not so much, had managed to immortalize a line of rat cells. But, the greatest prize was still on the horizon, an immortal line of human cells. Now, they tried to cultivate cancer cells before, but for some reason these cultures died after a few generations. Until, one day in 1951, Johns Hopkins sent GE a sample of cancerous cells. He described them as oddly purple, unlike any he had seen before. These were HeLa cells. They were a surprisingly aggressive form of cancerous cells, reproducing extremely quickly. And, finally, GE managed to cultivate a line of human cells that were effectively immortal. So, yes, cancer is immortal, but Henrietta basically had super cancer, which allowed her cells to stay alive in vitro. How were the cells immortalized? In order to immortalize a cell line, you have to grow them in a medium that will allow them to grow indefinitely. That's pretty much it. Some cells, however, are easier to grow than others. Why haven't the cell lines collapsed under the weight of all those mutations? Perhaps unsurprisingly, HeLa cells present a high number of mutations. It's rather complicated, but studies have shown that, as the cell lines advance, more and more HeLa cells present significant mutations, so much so that approximately 5% of cells in a culture are rendered oviable per generation, Most of these oviable cells have between 50 and 80 chromosomes, which is really messed up for human cells. However, even the most messed up of cell lines still has a non-insignificant number of functional, healthy cells, which are apparently enough to keep the whole thing going. Stuff like this, the hardiness despite all odds, is what makes HeLa cells so damn cool to work with. In fact, they tend to contaminate other cultures with alarming ease. Is it really 50 million tons of cells? There are not, at this point in time, 50 million tons of HeLa cells in the world. However, if you take the estimates from all applications involving these cells, all currently available cells, and all historically used cells, you would get an approximate amount close to 50 million tons. Which is kinda a lot. I just realized HeLa comes from Heriatala CKSUR, my spirit animal. Wow indeed. I loved the book / I hated the book / there is a movie / the movie sucks / there's a Radio Lab episode. I only mentioned the book because that was how I found out about HeLa. Personally, it's not my favorite book, and not even my favorite source on this story. But it exists, and it's a decent way for the average person to get a glimpse into this story. I have not watched the movie, nor listened to the show. Honestly, the best thing we can all do is to find out all we can about the topic. However you choose to do that is your choice. Closing remarks. Honestly, I'm glad that this has garnered so much attention. I just hope that people take the curiosity that this story has inspired, or the vague annoyance, and put it to good use. Read up on scientific topics if you don't already. Quarantine has us all stuck, and this can be a pretty cool way to spend your time. Also, thanks for the gold. Let me know if you have any other questions, corrections or comments. I'd be happy to help, if I can. Her tumor cells were harvested after she died and were found to continually be able to divide instead of dying like basically everyone else. Now they're used around the world for scientific testing and medical research. Edit, tumor cells. Also, I know how controversial the use of her cells are, how her family wasn't told about it until after, how they never got compensated, etc. Just figured it wasn't necessary to mention. I had to look this up, but basically she had cancer. Cancerous cells were taken from her, without her knowledge, but I think this was normal at the time, and found to be immortal, meaning they don't have a maximum number of possible replications. So as long as the conditions were right, they could grow as many cells as they wanted. I don't fully understand it exactly, but basically it allowed scientists to do medical research and testing dramatically more efficiently. I think because of consistency of the cells they were testing on, and they could get a large number of the same cell. Apparently over 10,000 patents involve these cells, and it led to a polio vaccine. It's crazy. I've never heard of her or her cells.